In their papers, all three philosophers, Michael Huemer, Peter de Marneffe, and Robert Goodin, all present their own arguments regarding the morality of drug legalization in the U.S. Each has their own perspective on how this should occur and if it should occur at all, and each presents their argument while also acknowledging the contra-arguments to their own claims. While all three have very different philosophies regarding how drug legalization should be approached, they do present their argument in a clear and concise method that allows the audience to reach their own conclusions. I will now go into further explanation into each of these philosophers' beliefs regarding drug legalization and allow the audience to reach their own conclusion based on the claims of these three philosophers. The first claim I will discuss is Michael Huemer's belief on drug legalization. Huemer is of the belief that all drugs should be legalized, and he makes this claim by discussing three different arguments, two of which he is against and presents his arguments against these claims, and one of which he is for. The arguments that he is against is the harm to the user argument and the harm to others argument, and he makes his own claims against these. And then at the end of his paper, he discusses the rights-based argument and is in support of this argument and uses that to back up his claim. To begin, for the harm to the user argument, it is a common claim when discussing drug legalization that because drugs can cause harm to the people who use them, the government should prevent people from using things that cause them harm, and therefore the government should ban the use of drugs. However, Huemer argues that this is a case of paternalism and states that if the government should ban all things that cause harm to its citizens, then they should also ban other things such as tobacco, alcohol, overeating, dropping out of college, all things that cause problems to people's quality of life, that the same effect is held by drugs. You can see there's a graphic that I will probably put here that will show that there are far more deaths related to tobacco in the US than by illegal drugs or any other type of drug use. So that's the argument that Huemer uses, stating that there are more statistical deaths per year from tobacco and overeating than there are from drug use, and that therefore the argument against anything that worsens someone's health should be illegal. Huemer says, since this is an improbable and impossible thing to work towards, that this argument is not permissible. So he simply says that the harm to user argument that many use to claim against drug legalization is not permissible, because if we are to ban the use of other things that hurt people, tobacco, overeating, alcohol, dropping out of college, etc., then that just wouldn't work in our society, and that would not fall through. In this case of paternalism is not permissible. The next argument that Huemer goes into is the potential harm to others argument. This is the second argument that Huemer is against, and presents his argument against this claim. So this argument basically states that the use of drugs can cause an end to relationships, both personal, physical, romantic, any type of relationship. The use of drugs will harm this and will cause an end to this. Huemer follows up with this by saying that it should not be illegal for someone to end a relationship, even if there's no good reason. He says that this isn't something that should be government regulated, because if drugs are illegal because they end relationships, so do people's jobs and people's other things that happen in people's lives where they just decide to end relationships for no good reason, and this shouldn't be something that the government takes part in. The harm to others argument also states that there can be financial difficulties because of how the user uses their money to buy the drugs. Huemer goes against this and says that the misuse of one's money should not be government regulated. A person can do whatever they want with their money, and the government should not regulate or have anything to do with how someone's money is spent. And finally, Huemer explains that the argument is against the direct harm to others due to the use of drugs. And so he says that this is the one part that he is in agreement with, that he states that just because driving while consuming drugs should be illegal does not mean that drugs should be illegal. So that's a quote from Huemer where he says, like, yes, there can be harm to others because of the use of a drug. However, like direct harm, like direct physical harm. However, that doesn't mean that just specifically the drug should be illegal. So he states that yes, while on the drug, you should not be able to drive, or you should not be in charge of a child while you're taking drugs. However, that does not make the drug illegal. So while he is firmly against the use of the drug causing interference into someone else's life, like driving or taking care of a child or any other list of responsibilities, he states that that does not make the drug illegal. Finally, Huemer presents his rights-based argument. So this is the argument that John Stuart Mills presents, and it's the harm principle that states one should be able to do whatever he or she likes as long as he or she does not harm another. So Huemer believes that someone is fully entitled to do anything that they want with their own body, and it is their right and should not be obstructed. So this kind of fills back into the harm to others argument, where as far as there can be physical harm to someone else because of the user using drugs, Huemer is against that. However, believes that if it's only harm to oneself that is coming, it is fully that person's autonomy and choice to make that decision. So now that we understand Huemer's argument in favor of drug legalization in the US, we can move on to understanding de Marneffe's argument. De Marneffe believes in prohibition and decriminalization. So he argues that drugs should be decriminalized, meaning that there's no penalty for the possession of small quantities of drugs. However, he believes that prohibition should exist. So while a user cannot be punished for possessing small quantities of a drug, there should be penalties for the manufacture, sale, or possession of large quantities of drugs. So instead of putting the blame on the user of the drug, he states that whoever is making, manufacturing, selling these drugs should be at fault. So he makes a cost-benefit analysis of the legalization and prohibition. He states that while a prohibitionist may argue that if drugs are legalized, that there will be more people using drugs, which will lead to a large increase in drug abuse, de Marneffe says that while there will be drug abuse because more people want to use the drugs, because more people want to use the drugs, they will be much easier to obtain, they will be safer to use and less expensive. He states that with the taxation of drugs and alcohol that made them more expensive, there has since been less use. Therefore, drug prohibition offers the best consequences. And there's a graphic here showing that the sales of alcohol decreased when the price increased, with the use of taxation against alcohol. So he's stating while there should be heavy taxes on the drug use so that people who really want to use drugs can, it'll be both safer, easier to obtain, they will know that there's no chance of lacing or other dangerous chemicals in the body because of this. So de Marneffe argues that we should make it safer for them, but if we make it more expensive, the drug use will decrease. because people just won't want to spend that much money to get the high. So then legalizers who argue that all drugs should be made legal argue that even with the drugs being banned, there's still a lot of drug use. So why keep the ban? Marneffe responds and says that there's still continuous theft, but that does not require us to repeal laws against larceny. So basically he says that legalization would lead to more drug addicts, more overdoses, and some will stop working and just steal to support their habit. Therefore, he states that just prohibiting drug manufacture and sale has better consequences. And then he finally recognizes the argument of autonomy and states that drug criminalization violates our right to liberty, whereas drug prohibition does not do so. So Marneffe is against paternalism because prohibition does not stop someone from using drugs or making them themselves, but criminalization takes away the choice of the person. So by criminalizing drugs, it takes away the choice of the person to do whatever they want with their own free will. So that's why Marneffe is in favor of prohibition instead of legalization or criminalization. He claims that to want to avoid objectionably sacrificing someone for the good of the society, and therefore prohibition does not violate the burdens principle and does not sacrifice anyone for the good of society. It allows anyone to make their own choices, however puts into place strict principles that makes the use of the sale of drugs much more expensive and much, while easier to obtain, potentially less likely for many people to become addicts. So now that we have a greater understanding of Marneffe's view on autonomy and paternalism, we can move on to understanding Goodin's argument in favor of paternalism when it comes to drug legalization. So Robert Goodin argues in favor of permissible paternalism. So he says that legal paternalism entails that a government is morally justified in passing laws to protect individuals from harming themselves. So he says that paternalism, if it is preventing someone from harming themselves, then it is absolutely permissible and is something that a government is supposed to do. Goodin goes on to state that paternalism should only be used in the case of big decisions or things that will substantially shape your subsequent life prospects. So he states that paternalism should only be in the case where policies are based on the individual's preferences. So things like starting to use drugs, dropping out of high school, having unprotected sex, things like that, which Huemer had previously said should not be regulated at all. Goodin argues is something that should absolutely be regulated and should absolutely be taken care of from the government's perspective. So then Goodin states a preferential argument for paternalism, stating that paternalism cannot exist when the state is sure that your preference is relevant, settled, preferred, and your own. So if these criteria are not met, then paternalism can be permissible. So basically what he is stating is that if a person's decision is not relevant, settled, preferred, and their own, then the government can step in and make their own decision based on what this person is deciding. So if someone is deciding to drop out of high school or college or whichever schooling type that they want to drop out of, and they have not come to this decision entirely on their own or are not entirely settled on the decision, then the government should step in and make that decision for them because they are not able to make that decision, which could affect a lot of their future life prospects. So he uses the case of a smoker to show that maybe that there are cases of unsettled preference where someone is making a choice against their own belief, but this still means that policy should be held on a stable preference, not brief ones. So he states that while a smoker might have decided to start smoking based on advertisements on making smoking seem to be like the next cool thing or something that will cause beauty and a longer life and all these false claims, that may not entirely be the user's own. So the smoker starts smoking and makes this decision, which can affect their entire life based on some false advertising. And so Goodin argues that this means that there should be stable preferences, so cases of long-term decisions, not just brief decisions that might not affect the full life prospects. So Goodin then goes on to form drug policies that he believes should come from this arguments. So he states that things that cause harm to oneself should be banned and only available via prescription. So any drugs that could potentially harm you should only be available via prescription, and obviously through a doctor's belief that this is something that will help you. Things should be expensive, especially for the young, so things that might harm someone should be expensive, should be taxed, which is also an argument that Marneffe made, that taxation should increase on things such as drugs to decrease the likelihood of use. So additionally, you want to ban the use of promotional materials to promote these products that could cause harm to a person. So for example, would be like smoking commercials. Those would be banned under these policies, which have already been banned. But any commercials for other like drugs or things like that should be banned, so as not to encourage these false ideas that could lead to someone starting a habit of drug use. And finally, prohibit the use of these in public spaces. So prohibit smoking in public places, prohibit drug use in public places, make this something that's illegal, and therefore make it much more difficult for someone to use a product except for in the safety of their own home. And so these policies will lead to a case of paternalism, but in Goodin's opinion will decrease the likelihood of drug addicts or deaths via the overuse of drugs. So in conclusion, all three philosophers, Huemer, Marneffe, and Goodin, present arguments regarding drug legalization in the United States. While Huemer is completely in favor of drug legalization, Marneffe argues that while drugs should not be legalized, they should be decriminalized, and there should be prohibition in the case of drug use. In contrast, Goodin states that the government is responsible to make policies against which can cause a person harm, and thus is firmly not in favor of drug legalization. While all three conclude with different arguments, they each present strong claims as to why they believe what they do in regards to drug legalization.